The chaos of UFC 313 had barely settled when Magomed Ankalaev unleashed a verbal storm unlike anything the fight world had seen. The newly crowned light heavyweight champion wasn't just celebrating his victory. He was on a mission, a ruthless, unapologetic campaign to silence every doubter, every critic, and every fighter who had ever questioned him. And as his post-fight tirade continued to spiral across social media, one thing became painfully clear: nobody was safe. Not Jiri Prochazka. Not John Jones. And now, not even Khalil Rountree Jr. It started as whispers, a flickering ember of controversy that quickly erupted into a wildfire. A video had surfaced online, capturing Rountree's reaction during the main event, his expression betraying something more than just casual disappointment. It was frustration, resentment, disgust even, as Ankalaev systematically dismantled Alex Pereira to claim the UFC light heavyweight throne. Rountree, once a hopeful contender himself, had watched on with clenched fists and a tight jaw, unable to mask his emotions. The moment the clip went viral, the shark smelled blood, and none were hungrier than the man who now held the belt. Ankalaev wasted no time, seizing the opportunity to humiliate Rountree with a cold-blooded social media assault. His words were sharp, dripping with venom. "Khalil Bumtree upset I beat his daddy." The insult hit hard, a blatant jab at Rountree's apparent support for Pereira, and just like that, the floodgates opened. Fans and fighters alike swarmed the comments, either laughing at the audacity of Ankalaev's words or rallying to Rountree's defense. But the champion wasn't done. His message carried more than just an insult. It carried intent, a clear, undeniable declaration of war. And to drive his point home, he threw his weight behind Jamahal Hill, Rountree's upcoming opponent, making his allegiances known. "Let's go, Jamahal." It wasn't the first time Ankalaev had fired shots after a fight, but this time, something felt different. There was a rawness to his words, an unfiltered aggression that hinted at something deeper. Maybe it was the years of being overlooked, the endless struggle for recognition in a division overshadowed by legends like John Jones. Maybe it was the way people had dismissed him, doubted his legitimacy, labeled him as a fighter who could never be champion. Whatever the reason, Ankalaev wasn't just defending his belt. He was rewriting the narrative, making sure the world knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. His relentless campaign didn't stop with Rountree. No, Ankalaev had bigger targets in mind. He turned his attention back to Alex Pereira, the man he had just defeated, and made it clear that the rivalry was far from over. The victory had been decisive, yet to Ankalaev, it hadn't been enough. He wanted more. He wanted to shatter any illusion that Pereira had belonged in that cage with him. And so, in his post-fight press conference, he laid out his accusations with chilling certainty. "It was very different from what we envisioned," Ankalaev stated, his expression as unreadable as ever. "As you know, usually Pereira hunts for the finish, as you could see. He was running away from me." The words carried weight. They weren't just a critique. They were an insult, a direct challenge to Pereira's warrior spirit. Ankalaev wasn't simply claiming victory, he was erasing the very idea that Pereira had ever been a threat. "For 20 minutes, this guy was running away from me," he continued, his tone unwavering. "Maybe in the rematch, he can fight for real and not just run away the entire time." A statement like that wasn't just about the fight, it was about perception. Ankalaev knew how to play the game. He knew that in the fight world, dominance wasn't just about winning. It was about controlling the narrative. If he could convince the fans, the UFC brass, and most importantly, Pereira himself, that his opponent had been nothing more than a desperate man on the run. Then the psychological edge would be his before they ever stepped into the cage again. The MMA community erupted. Some called Ankalaev's words disrespectful, arguing that Pereira had fought strategically against a dangerous opponent. Others cheered him on, admiring his refusal to bow to traditional post-fight pleasantries. But no matter which side they took, one thing was undeniable: Ankalaev had made himself impossible to ignore. His victory at UFC 313 had been definitive, yet here he was, still swinging, still fighting battles outside the cage. He wasn't satisfied with just being the champion. He wanted to be feared, respected, a force so undeniable that even his detractors had no choice but to acknowledge his reign. And as the days passed and the dust settled, one question remained: who would be next? Because if one thing was certain, it was that Magomed Ankalaev was far from finished. The storm that Magomed Ankalaev had unleashed showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, his words were only gathering more force, sending shockwaves through the MMA world as his unapologetic war of dominance extended far beyond the octagon. It was no longer just about winning fights. It was about reshaping the division, about making every name in the rankings bow to his reign, whether through brutal knockouts or the sheer weight of his words. And as the days passed, his targets multiplied. Khalil Rountree Jr. was only the latest, but he would not be the last. The fallout from his social media attack on Rountree was instantaneous. The moment Ankalaev posted his mocking words, the MMA community erupted. Fighters, analysts, and fans alike took to Twitter, Instagram, and forums to dissect the statement. Was it a simple jab, a mind game to rattle Rountree ahead of his fight with Jamahal Hill? Or was this personal? The phrase "Khalil Bumtree upset, I beat his daddy" spread like wildfire, a cruel twist of words that seemed to taunt not just Rountree, but anyone who had dared to align themselves with Alex Pereira. Ankalaev was making it clear if you stood against him, you would be humiliated. You would be silenced. Rountree, a man who had built his career on silent determination and raw power, now found himself at a crossroads. He had always let his fists do the talking, never one to engage in online feuds. But this was different. The entire world had seen that clip of him watching UFC 313, his disapproval evident, and now he was being dragged into a war of words he had never asked for. Would he respond? Would he ignore it and let his next fight speak for itself? Or would he be goaded into a public battle he couldn't win? Meanwhile, Ankalaev's words about Pereira continued to burn through the headlines. His claims that Pereira had run during their fight were not just an attack on the former champion's performance, they were an attempt to strip him of his identity as a feared striker. Pereira, the man who had built his name on brutal finishes, was being accused of cowardice. And that accusation did more damage than any punch ever could. Pereira had been silent since the loss, choosing not to engage in the verbal warfare that had consumed the division. But silence could be dangerous. In a world where perception was everything, where narratives could shape the future as much as victories, Ankalaev's words had the power to define how the fight would be remembered. If enough people believed it, if the fans, the media, and even the UFC itself started to accept Ankalaev's version of events, then Pereira's legacy would take a hit. The loss wouldn't just be a loss. It would be seen as a failure of spirit, a moment where he had supposedly run from the fire instead of standing his ground. And that was something no true warrior could allow. Yet even as Ankalaev relished his moment, he knew the war was far from over. Because lurking in the shadows, watching everything unfold, was Jon Jones. The specter of Jones had loomed over the light heavyweight division for years, even after he had left for heavyweight. And Ankalaev, despite his dominance, was still fighting in Jones' shadow. He had already taken aim at the former champion, throwing out veiled insults and challenges, but Jones had yet to respond. The silence was deafening. And that was the problem. For all his victories, for all his power, Ankalaev knew that in the eyes of the world, he would never be the true king until he either defeated Jon Jones or forced him to acknowledge his existence. But how do you fight a ghost? How do you chase a man who refuses to engage? Ankalaev's frustration grew, and with it, his attacks on anyone who stood in his way. If he couldn't fight Jones, then he would make every other fighter in the division suffer in his place. And so, the carnage continued. He doubled down on his words, fueling the fire with more taunts, more accusations, more displays of his unshakable belief in his own supremacy. The message was clear: he was here to stay. He was here to rule. And if you had a problem with it, then step into the cage and do something about it. As the days passed, the MMA world held its breath. Would Rountree break his silence? Would Pereira demand an immediate rematch to reclaim his honor? Would Jon Jones finally acknowledge the man who was threatening to take his place as the greatest light heavyweight of all time? The air was thick with uncertainty, with tension, with the promise of wars yet to come. And in the center of it all, standing defiantly, was Magomed Ankalaev, champion, destroyer, and the man who was rewriting the future of the UFC with every word he spoke.